Por in Spanish means by or through, and para means for. Sometimes the two prepositions have the same meaning but are used in different situations, so you cannot use them interchangeably. In this video, I'd like to explain all the differences between them and how to use them in what context, mainly speaking of movement, time, and action, which both por and para use, but in different circumstances. Starting with the first usage of por, this preposition can literally mean by or through, which involves movement, but it's used as other prepositions when it comes down to the duration of an event or a reason for a circumstance. For instance, you can use por when speaking of the preposition by or through, like yo fui por el parque, which literally means I went by or through the park, which logically makes sense both in English and Spanish. However, saying a sentence like yo lo hice por 2 horas indicates I did it for 2 hours, with por acting as the preposition for in English, and it is tricky to understand. The best tip that I can give to understand this better is instead of thinking of the sentence in English, you can logically think of por as something that's used for a duration or during something, which leads to the second use of por. Instead of saying I did it for 2 hours, we can think of it as I did it during 2 hours, which demonstrates the use of a duration through the preposition por, which is why por is used. It is tricky to understand, but that's the closest connection I can give it in English. Another way to use por is for a reason of action, like in the sentence yo llegué tarde a la casa por el tráfico, which means I arrived late to the house because of the traffic. And in this context, por is used as the preposition because there's a reason of the action done in the sentence, and that's the closest connection I can give it. Now, to get more precise with por, we have to take a look at movement, time, and action a bit more specifically. Aside from these categories, por can also be used in topics like in the search for and exchange, units of measurement, and idiomatic expressions. For instance, saying yo fui por mi lápiz indicates that I went for my pencil, which visually doesn't make sense in English with the preposition for, but another way to look at the sentence is I went in search of my pencil, which is why por has to be used in this context. Another example can be an exchange, like in the sentence yo te di dinero por el boleto, meaning I gave you money for the ticket. Once again, por functions as the preposition for in English, but another way to say the sentence is I gave you money in exchange for the ticket, with the words in exchange for all meaning por in Spanish. Even though it's hard to understand, that's the closest connection I can give it. Por can also be used for units of measurement, like yo conducía a 120 kilómetros por hora, which means I was driving 120 kilometers per hour, with por acting as the preposition per. Even though it's not a useful sentence, it does make sense for use of por. At last, por is also used for idiomatic expressions like por ejemplo and por fin, which mean for example and at last. And you have the prepositions for and at, which don't really make sense in English, but once again, that's how por functions with movement, time, and action. In summary, por applies to these circumstances, but the critical part to remember is that it applies to past or current movement, time, and action. With more examples on the way, por specifically indicates things like a general motion, like by or through, a duration of action, as in during, a reason for an action, like because of, an object of a search, as in search of, an exchange, like in exchange for, units of measurement, as in per, and idiomatic phrases, like these ones. That's how por functions in Spanish. Para, on the other hand, literally translates as for, but sometimes functions like other prepositions. Just like por, para also applies to movement, time, and action, but in these cases, para indicates an event in the future or a purpose for an event. For instance, saying a sentence like yo salgo para Las Vegas el lunes means I leave for Las Vegas on Monday, indicating a destination that I'm going to reach, which is an event that's gonna happen in the future. However, saying something like yo lo voy a hacer para el viernes means I'm going to do it by Friday. And in this tricky context, the word para acts as the preposition by in English, which doesn't make sense, but it does function as a deadline in the future, which is why para is used. Another way to look at the sentence is I'm going to do it on Friday, with para acting as the preposition on, which still indicates a deadline in the future. At last, para can also demonstrate a purpose for an action, like in the sentence yo estudio español para ser profesor, meaning I study Spanish to be a teacher. Even though there's completely no preposition in the sentence, by saying I study Spanish to be a teacher, what we're trying to say is I study Spanish in order to be a teacher, with para acting as a purpose of the action, literally meaning in order to. This sentence can also be written the opposite way. Para ser profesor, yo estudio español. In order to be a teacher, I study Spanish. I believe that this is the easiest form of para to remember because para in this context will always come before a verb, indicating in order to, and that's the closest connection I can give it. However, para has other uses that are more logical than por once you put the context into English. Still falling into the category of movement, time, and action, para can be used for being the recipient of something, a comparison with others, and in the employment of. For instance, saying something like este regalo es para él means this gift is for him, with him acting as the recipient of the phrase, which is why para is used as for. Saying something like para mí esta lección es fácil means for me this lesson is easy, comparing the lesson with myself, and in this context, para is also used as for in English. At last, you can also use para in the employment of, such as ella trabaja para telecom, meaning she works for telecom. And once again, para is used as for. In summary, para applies to movement, time, and action, but what's important to remember is that it applies to events that will happen in the future, like destinations, deadlines, and purposes, along with recipients of something, comparisons, and employment. Overall, the crucial part to remember about por and para is that they both apply for movement, time, and action while sharing different circumstances in each category. Por may apply to a general motion, the duration of an event, and the reason for an action, including ideas like an object of a search, an exchange, units of measurement, and idiomatic statements. Para also applies to movement, time, and action, but mainly speaks of events in the future, like destinations, deadlines, and purposes, while having recipients of something, comparisons, and employment. The biggest tip that I can give to understand when to use por and when to use para is to always remember that por is used more for movement, time, and action in the past, but para is used more for movement, time, and action in the future. And as always, these are the closest connections I can give them in English. This has been por and para in Spanish. Thank you for watching this video, and hopefully I made your learning just a bit simpler.